This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, good morning, everybody. It's just about 10 o'clock, and welcome to our 10th installment of Preservation Conversations. It's kind of hard to believe we're already at 10 weeks, which means we've, at least I've been officially quarantined in my house for 12 weeks. But thank you so much for joining us, those of you who are with us live, and those of you who will be watching on YouTube afterwards. So we are excited for the topic today, and today we'll be talking about preservation grant programs with Paul Holtz and Chris Skelly from the Massachusetts Historical Commission. So just a few housekeeping things as usual. Just a reminder to mute your phones, help cut down on background noise, and we can hear our presenters speak. If you have any questions, which I'm sure there will be questions today, you can use the chat feature in your GoToMeeting portal. It looks like the little conversation bubble, and you can send questions throughout the presentation, but we're going to reserve time at the end. Of our conversation for question and answer period. And also just let you know that this is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube and website in the next couple of days. So we've really been enjoying having these conversations with you, which was really just started as a positive way to connect, communicate, and share during a time when we all were finding ourselves, at home and not really seeing people in person anymore. So we're really looking forward to continuing this. And if you have any information, feedback, ideas on future topics, please feel free to share them with us, share them with myself or with Chris Skelly. We'll have our emails up on the slide at the end of the conversation. So as I said, today's topic is Mass Historic Commission grant programs. And we are very, very pleased to be joined by Paul Holtz, the historical architect and the co-director of the grants division at Mass Historical, and also someone who's been with us for the past 9 weeks, Chris Skelly, the director of local government programs at the Mass Historic Commission. And also we have the PM staff on as well, Jim, Jeff, Stacia, Nick, and myself. I'm Erin Kelly. So with this, I will turn it over to Paul, who I believe is going to kick off talking about the MPPF program. So Paul, thank you so much for being with us, and take it away.
Great, thank you, Erin. It's my pleasure to share information about the Massachusetts Preservation Project Fund, which we'll be referring to as MPPF. The MPPF, if you want to advance it, please. The MPPF program dates all the way back to 1984, and we actually have had this program continuously, except for a minor interruption between 1990 and 1994. So we've actually gone with continuous funding since 1994 through the present, with an annual cycle each year. Over this time period, we have awarded over $60 million to historic structures, landscapes, vessels, and objects, all with a common denominator of being included in the state or national register of historic places. Everything that is discussed today will actually be available on the Mass Historic Commission website. And the fastest way to get to the Mass Historic Commission website that I know of is to plug in mass.gov, that's mass.gov. And once you get there, that's the Commonwealth of Massachusetts website. There's a search box, and if you simply plug in MHC for Mass Historic Commission, it will get you to the Mass Historic Commission's homepage. And once you're there, roughly in the middle of the page, new at the MHC will include references to MPPF. And you will have options to get an overview of the program, which is much of what I'm going to be talking about today. You also will have an option to see prior grant awards, and those awards actually go all the way back to round 10 for the MPPF program through round 25, which was awarded last year. And you will also see left on the site the MPPF application materials from the round that has already gone by. That would be the round 26. You will see instructions for the applications and an actual a separate attachment for the application itself. So if you are very interested in pursuing MPPF after this presentation, feel free to go to that website and to use the application materials as basically as a guide for the future applications. You certainly don't want to fill out the application materials. There will be an upcoming round 27, but it will give you guidance as to what to expect when the new information is released. So if you could go to the next slide, Aaron. The Massachusetts Preservation Projects Fund is the program actually was established in '84 to replace a very similar program that had been funded through the National Park Service. And that funding had gone on through the 70s through the early 1980s. That was actually federal money, National Park Service money that was administered by the Mass Historic Commission. That funding basically ended in 1983 with the federal jobs bill, and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts decided that it was a priority to maintain a program like that. So the MPPF was newly established and continues today. The program is based on a 50-50 matching share. In other words, when you apply, you are putting up an identical amount to match the amount that you're pursuing from the state. The program involves a reimbursement. In other words, for the vast majority of our projects involve development or construction. And the way it's set up, you would actually expend your full matching share and then be in line to be coming in for reimbursement. So there is the need for cash flow. And if you go through the actual application process, you will see that it's required that you not only are able to put up 50% to match the amount that you're applying for, but you, on a temporary basis, also need to be able to cover temporary cash flow to keep payments being made to the contractors involved. Next slide, please. In order to qualify for the MPPF program, you would need to be a registered nonprofit organization or a city or town within the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Unfortunately, this program does not cater to private homeowners. In addition to being either a nonprofit or a municipality, you also need to have as the subject of your potential application an historic resource property that is included in the State Register of Historic Places. Next slide, please. There are three types of MPPF grants. There are emergency acquisitions, which is a very rare portion of the MPPF program. We literally will see one maybe every 3 or 4 years. There's the pre-development type and the development type. As I mentioned, the development grants represent the vast majority of the requests that come in. I would say probably maybe 80 to 90% of the requests that we see are for development funds. Pre-development funds are also relatively common, and we are quick to point out that if you do apply for pre-development funds, we really strongly encourage you then to follow up after you've completed your pre-development study to follow up with a request for development based on the recommendations that have been that come out of the pre-development study process, the recommendations that your consultants make to follow up and to select the highest priority work that has been identified in that study. So those are the three types of MPPF grant types, and it is not possible to include more than one in an application to us. For example, it would not be possible to come in for a pre-development and a development at the same time, or any other possible connection of these three different types, just one at a time. Next slide, please. The emergency acquisitions, as I said, are quite rare. In this photo, you're actually looking at an example of an emergency acquisition that goes back quite a number of years. If any of you can identify it, you score some points. This is the 1834 John Howland Jr. house, which was constructed during the whaling era in New Bedford. The owner at the time of this emergency acquisition award was WHALE, the Waterfront Historic Area League of New Bedford. They saved this from demolition and eventually turned it over to a developer who has successfully turned it into, I believe, multi-unit residential. I think 4 units are now included in this property. You're looking at obviously a before photo. So again, this is one of the three types. In order to qualify for emergency acquisition, you need to demonstrate to the Mass Historic Commission there is absolute imminent threat of either demolition or inappropriate alteration. It's not an easy threshold to prove or to demonstrate, and it's one of those things. It's a nice aspect of the program to have for those rare occasions, but not utilized a lot. Next slide, please. Pre-developments. The pre-development type of grant involves varying types of studies, and you're looking at an example of a fairly recently completed study involving the Oaks Ames Memorial Hall in Northeaston. This is a H.H. Richardson building, one of several actually in the town of Northeaston. Next slide, please. Historic structure reports, feasibility studies are all categorized as pre-development projects. A typical historic structures report would involve varying topics, including the historic development of the structure or historic resource, a condition survey that is keying in on the existing conditions, treatment recommendations for both stabilizing and potentially restoring features of the building, detailed cost estimates that would quantify the costs for all of these treatments. And typically there would also be some limited plans and specifications addressing the highest priority needs that come out of the study process. And finally, a maintenance plan, an overall maintenance plan that would provide guidance for future upkeep of the property. Next slide, please. And finally, we have the development grant, which again is the most popular and represents the largest percentage of the applications that come in. Development projects are construction projects that involve actual physical repair or restoration of an historic resource. And in these photos, you're seeing varying examples. We really do a very wide range of projects. The vast majority of those projects involve exterior stabilization work. On the left, you're seeing a replacement of a wood shingle roof on a house museum. On the middle image, you're looking at stained glass window conservation, which we do. However, we will no longer be able to do stained glass window conservation for religious properties, but we actually are undertaking stained glass conservation right now on an historic city hall building in the city of Holyoke. So there still are occasions when we do stained glass, but not on religious properties. And the property on the right is another example of a museum property where we are doing masonry, partial rebuilding and repointing. Next slide, please. In terms of the types of work that are considered allowable or fundable, really a wide variety of construction. The majority would be exterior stabilization, preservation, more limited amounts of rehabilitation and restoration. When it comes to interior work, we will not consider any type of interior rehabilitation to be eligible under the MPPF guidelines. The vast majority of interior examples of projects that have received interior funding would involve restoration to a specific time period based on documentation, historic evidence that is actually provided along with the application. So we will certainly not do any sort of period appropriate type of project where there's guesswork involved. We will actually need to have either records, photographic, written records, or fragmentary evidence as the basis for a proposed interior project. Interior work, or actually work in general, can include handicapped accessibility, universal access. However, we do put a stipulation on that if you're applying for handicapped accessibility, that it be a smaller component of a larger preservation project. And we've set a guideline of no more than 30% of the overall project. That would be, in other words, if you're applying for a $50,000 grant, there's a mandatory matching share of $50,000. We would set a limit of no more than $30,000 of the overall $100,000 project that you've come in for and described to us, along with other supplemental historic preservation work that would also meet our guidelines. In terms of grant costs, in addition to the actual cost of construction, we will also consider eligible for MPPF reimbursement the cost of a project sign, the cost of photography that is required in order to document the process, and for the purpose of pulling together a final completion report at the end of the project. We will also consider eligible for reimbursement the recording fee associated with the recording of a preservation restriction agreement, and also legal ads that would be necessary as part of the public procurement process, or the hiring of a general contractor. Next slide, please. In terms of what would be considered not eligible under the MPPF guidelines for a construction project, really any type of routine maintenance. Routine maintenance would typically be, an example of that would be exterior painting. And there are some exceptions to that. If you are undertaking a comprehensive project where there's a lot of carpentry work and the need to do overall repainting, if the applicant is willing and understands there's a firm commitment to do historic paint color analysis and to actually fully utilize the results of the historic paint color analysis, regardless of what those colors are, we will actually consider painting as well. But in most cases, people simply want to repaint to match the existing color, or to come up with some color of their choosing. In that case, painting would be considered routine maintenance and would not be eligible. Other types of ineligible costs would involve any sort of mechanical system work, mechanical systems referring to electrical, plumbing, air conditioning, heating, that sort of thing. None of those systems would be eligible under our program. Also, renovating non-historic spaces, or as I mentioned earlier, any sort of rehabilitation of an interior space that would not be directly linked to thorough historic materials, information to support the proposed project. The relocating or moving of historic buildings is not eligible. The costs associated with the construction of additions would not be eligible. Specific to historic properties, as I mentioned earlier, we will no longer consider stained glass window conservation to be eligible, and also relating to religious properties. Actually, we've never allowed interior work within religious properties, but in addition to the stained glass windows, we also have eliminated the possibility for stabilization work or restoration work of any other religious symbols associated with the exterior of a church. Designer fees, the costs of engineering or architecture fees are not considered eligible for any development projects. We do require all of our development projects, regardless of how simple or regardless of what the scope would be, that you need to have on board an historical architect or an engineer with historical experience, and the cost for their services would be provided by the applicant outside of the grant agreement process. Next slide, please. In terms of the ceilings for requested amounts, for pre-development studies, we will entertain a request beginning at $5,000 up to a maximum of $30,000. That would result in a $10,000 study, taking the $5,000 and multiplying that by 2 with the addition of the matching share requirement. And for a requested grant for pre-development for at a $30,000 amount, that would allow for a $60,000 study to be conducted. So those are the minimums and maximums for pre-development. For construction projects as well as for emergency acquisitions, the maximum grant request is $100,000, and we've established a minimum amount, a minimum request amount of $7,500. Given that we are working under, for the last dozen years or so, an overall budget for the MPPF program of $800,000 to cover the entire state, we really could never justify at this stage of a $100,000 grant award. So we tend to top off anywhere between $50,000 and $60,000 for an individual request. Now, of course, you're free to apply for the full amount that is posted in our application materials, but we will reserve the right to pare back the request based on the field of applicants, there'll be no penalty, but it's very likely that request amount will be reduced if you come in for the maximum amount. Next slide, please. There is a preservation restriction that is associated with all MPPF projects, whether you're coming in for an emergency acquisition, a pre-development, or a development project. There is the requirement that you enter into a preservation restriction with the Mass Historic Commission. If you are coming in for either an acquisition project or a development project, that restriction will run in perpetuity. If you're coming in for a pre-development request, the length or the term for that restriction will range from either 5 years to 10 years, depending on the size of the grant. The preservation restriction has 2 primary stipulations to it. The first is that you will adequately maintain the historic resource for the period of the restriction. And the second stipulation is that any proposed substantial alteration needs to be submitted, or you would need to apply to the Mass Historic Commission for a request for alteration. And we will then review and either approve your request or go back to you asking for for additional information, basically wanting to make sure that whatever you're proposing is in keeping with good preservation standards, the standards that we rely on, or the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. That those same standards are the basis for our entire MPPF process, and those same standards apply throughout the office, actually, to all of the other activities and compliance that we undertake, the tax credit programs, etc. Next slide, please. And finally, here is an example of one of the MPPF signs that you may have run across anywhere throughout the Commonwealth. We actually hold approximately 800 preservation restrictions based on not only one grant, but in many cases multiple grants to the same historic resource, the same type of project sign that you're seeing in this image. We use the same image or specifications so that it's very recognizable as an MPPF sign. So from there I will pass it along to Chris to talk about the Mass Historic Commission Survey and Planning Grant Program.
All right, thanks, Paul. And thanks, Erin, for having us here. So Paul talked about basically the bricks and mortar grant program that our office has. And what I'm going to talk about is our survey and planning grant program. And you can think of that really as some sort of paper product as opposed to a bricks and mortar grant. Survey and planning grants are going to be something that really ends up, the final product is really going to be something that ends up on paper, whether that's an inventory forms or a National Register nomination, a preservation plan, design guidelines, things like that. I'll talk about those a little bit more in a bit, but the main thing is that it is a paper product. Survey and planning grants are basically where a consultant is hired to usually go do the work. So a preservation consultant is how it most often works, is a consultant's going to be hired to go out and prepare inventory forms or prepare a National Register nomination, a preservation plan. And the main goals of the survey and planning grant program is really the basic steps of historic preservation planning. Identifying historic resources, evaluating historic resources, and protecting historic resources. So that's basically how our state historic preservation plan works, and I'll mention that in a little bit as well. So all of the projects are going to have to somehow have a goal there of identifying, evaluating, or protecting historic resources in the Commonwealth. All right, next slide. Thanks. Okay, so these where MPPF funds are actually coming from the state government, the survey and planning grant funds come down through our office through the National Park Service. So the National Park Service distributes what's called the HPF, the Historic Preservation Fund, and that goes to all the state historic preservation offices around the country. And that's a portion based on a specific formula. So Mass Historical Commission gets a certain amount of the HPF each year, and some of those funds then get transferred over to our survey and planning grant program. So that's the basic way that where these funds are actually coming from our office. They are coming from the National Park Service. Okay, next slide. All right, now I'm going to mention some of the typical projects that get funded through Survey and Planning Grant Program. By far, the most of the projects that we fund and really get applied for, most of those are for historic property surveys. So I think, I suspect most of the people on the call today are on local historical commissions and are familiar with how we identify and document and describe historic resources around the state. So it's basically on these forms, MHC forms. So you're seeing a Form B for a building right there. So there's several 100,000 of these forms that we have for cities and towns across the state. And it's always a process of trying to update those forms, increase the number of forms that you have in your community. These forms are basically the building block of everything that we do when we talk about historic preservation planning, because you can't really do anything unless you've identified what you have in your community already. All right, National Register nominations. So that would be the second part of that process where we've identified historic resources. Now you might look at evaluating historic resources to see what's significant. So we don't have too many National Register nominations that come in through this program, but we certainly usually have a couple each, one or two each year. So a couple of key points here with funding National Register nominations through their Survey and Planning Grant Program is one, it's typically meant for districts. If it's an individual property, it's really got to be a public property or a nonprofit property. We don't fund private property, individual properties through this program. Another couple key pieces here for National Register nominations are you had to have done your survey ahead of time so that you have some sense of what you have in your community. And that seems pretty obvious. I think that you would know, before you looked at what was significant in the community, you'd want to have identified what you have in your community through the survey process. So you have to have some decent survey ahead of time. And then before you apply for a Survey and Planning Grant Program for a National Register nomination, it's really good to make sure that Mass Historical Commission has done the evaluation already, so that just to find out whether we think it's eligible for the National Register. So we do get pre-applications that come in, and we haven't been involved yet, and so we defer on those ones for that year because we don't know whether we haven't done a formal evaluation on whether that district meets the criteria for the National Register. And then the last piece here to think about for National Register nominations is we really want to have some sort of documented support from property owners and local officials that they are supportive of a National Register nomination here. Okay, next slide. Okay, so these are the ones that I tend to be more involved with, the preservation plans. So the two most recent ones we've done here are North Attleboro and the City of Salem. And so a preservation plan is really a chance to take an overall comprehensive look at all the kinds of things that you might need in terms of running an effective preservation program in your community. So it would look at all the inventory, documenting historic resources. It might look at what's on the National Register right now, what needs to be on the National Register. It might look at all your local bylaws and ordinances. It might look at capital improvements or zoning or municipal policy. All kinds of things like that would go into a preservation plan we'll come up with a number of recommendations. And we don't have a lot of preservation plans in Massachusetts, so we would certainly like to see more of these. it really does help give a local commission a good set of understanding on the kinds of things that are needed to move forward with their preservation program. Okay. All right. Next slide. And then local historic district design guidelines. So if you have a local historic district established through a local bylaw or ordinance, you could apply for preparing design guidelines. The last one that we funded through this program was New Bedford. So not too frequently that this happens for design guidelines, but that's certainly an eligible activity as well. Okay, next slide. All right, so it is possible to actually hire a staff person. So this doesn't happen very frequently either, but we've done a few of these in Salem, Somerville, Lowell over the years, and that's actually having a part-time, in this case it was in Salem, part-time preservation planner available.
Call from Bert John.
Okay, could we have whoever that is, can we ask you to please mute your phone if you're not talking? Thank you very much. Sorry, Chris, go ahead.
Okay, yep. Okay, so staff support, a possibility to hire actually a professional that would work within in city or town hall, providing support to the local historic district or the local historical commission in terms of administering a local historic district or inventory forms, just kind of the basics of what a preservation planner would do full time. This could be someone that's there available to do those things through a contracted basis. What we really like to see is when a staff person funded through the Survey and Planning Grant Program then gets hired at some point by the city because it's going really well and recognize that that position is important. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we do have some pre-development projects that are allowed through this program. This is limited to certified local governments, which I'll mention in a minute, what that part is. A few limitations here are that it has to be National Register listed, has to be a public or private nonprofit organization, and like I said, it can only be the certified local governments that it's eligible for. So some of the other projects that might get funded are things like public outreach materials. There's a few other categories. We did a wonderful project a few years ago in Methuen, which was a walking tour brochure. So there are some other possibilities as well. Okay, next slide. Okay, so yeah, I mentioned certified local governments. We have 25 certified local governments in Massachusetts. And so the interesting thing about the Survey and Planning Grant Program is that 10% of the Historic Preservation Fund received by each state historic preservation office must be passed through to certified local governments. So some years, that means these grants are only available to CLGs. Okay, next slide. So how would you become a certified local government? You have to have a local historic district established by town meeting or city council. That is a minimum requirement to be a CLG. After that, it's a matter of applying to our office and making sure that you meet some of the other basic requirements of having a local preservation program in your community. Okay, next slide. So even as a CLG, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get a grant. It just means that you have a much higher chance of getting a grant because 10% of those funds have to go to CLGs. All right, next slide. Our eligible applicants are local historical commissions, historic district commissions, municipal planning offices, regional planning offices, educational institutions, CLGs, private nonprofit organizations. Next slide. Oh, next slide, if you could. Now, it is a matching grant program, so 50% comes from that historic preservation fund, and then 50% comes from the local grant recipient. So what that means is that you have to have all of those funds available ahead of time. So the local match could be from Community Preservation Act funds or general funds, community development block grant funds, things like that. And I would just point out that a cash match is strongly encouraged here, even though our pre-application does talk about some volunteer time. We really do encourage a cash match. All right, next slide. All right, so that schedule, this is an annual program. And so there's a pre-application, which happens in the fall. And then if you get approved by the pre-application, we invite you in for a full application. The grants are awarded in March. Then procurement, contracting, hiring a consultant, all those kinds of things happens. And then the project itself takes place usually during September to June. Then there's a closeout process of getting all the final paperwork, documentation together, and then we reimburse for the full amount by December is the plan. So we have the pre-application and the full application process. That works pretty well because the pre-application is really quick and easy. It's really just one page. So I think that works well because we can quickly let you know you're on the right track, or you're not coming in for necessarily if you made a few changes. We can get that together quickly and recommend that you come in next year easily. Okay, next slide. So some administration here in terms of needing a project coordinator. Projects follow a contracted scope of work. The consultant selection process follows an open procurement requirements. You cannot have pre-selected consultants. And then we have phase meetings to monitor progress and review products throughout the whole time. Next slide. And at the end, there's a completion report that the local project coordinator fills out. You have to do all the financial documentation. And then that reimbursement process takes place at the end there, once the project is completed and the allowable costs expended. And then I should just probably mention minimum projects, minimum grant amounts are $7,500 for a total project cost of $15,000. Minimum on the survey is $12,500 for a total project cost of $25,000. Most awards that we give out are between the $10,000 and $20,000 range. Okay, next slide. All right, so happy to take some questions, but there's certainly more information on our website on survey and planning grants. And happy to answer questions by email later too.
Great. Chris and Paul, thank you so very much. This has been hugely informative, and we've had great attendance this time. Thank you so very much for sharing this very important information about two really key preservation funding programs for Massachusetts. So we do have some questions that have come in through the little chat app. And I'll ask just a quick one that kind of that came in. Someone asked if the slides are available for download, and of course I defer to you because you both are the owners of these slides, of these PowerPoints, so that is up to you. So
Chris,
Paul, do you want to mention? Do you want to go first, Paul?
Yeah, we have released our PowerPoints on occasion. Yeah, so they would be available.
Okay, yeah,
okay.
And my slides can certainly go out as well.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. I guess if anyone is interested in actually getting a copy of these PowerPoints, we can send them just to make the file sizes a little bit shorter. We can send them as PDFs, but I guess I would say if you would like a copy of either MPPF or the S&P or both, I guess you could email me, and with Paul and Chris's approval, I can send those out. So you can just email me if that's okay.
Sure, or they can email us directly. They can also email us directly.
Wonderful. Okay. So, and if anyone has Chris's email is going to be everybody sees Chris's email, but Paul, your email, I believe, is it
it's
Paul?
It's the same as Chris's, but Paul.Holtz, HOLTZ, and then it's the same as Chris's after that.
Great, thank you. Okay, so if you would like to receive copies of these, I would encourage you to contact Paul and Chris directly. It'll just make things a lot easier. So, okay, a question, I believe this one was, and I'm going to try to answer these, try to get as many of these answered while we're still here. I believe, Paul, this is probably directed, this came up during the MPPF section. To your knowledge, are there banks or financial institutions that would fund a project's financial needs pending the receipt of the grant? And then they asked about the dollar amounts of the grant, but you did cover that. So just from your experience as administrator, and all the projects you've seen over the years, do you know, or is this something that should be taken up with a specific local lender?
We see a wide range of funding sources for our projects. We do require a cash match for the vast majority of our projects. We will allow a line of credit as long as we have a direct or a detailed confirmation from the bank giving us the terms, making sure that they match closely the time frame for our grants project. So typically we would only see lines of credit. If there is any other kind of a loan, we're typically just asking the grantee for verification that they have the funding available. If they've pursued it through a bank, we wouldn't necessarily know it. So I don't know if that answers the question exactly, but we typically don't see really any other form of bank match involvement of the bank other than the line of credit.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Another question, can you name a few examples of interior projects that have been funded by MPPF?
Yes, the John Goff House in Central Mass is one example that's actually received a couple of different grants, and that involved interior restoration work. Another example going back a few more years would be Wisteria Hearst Museum in the city of Holyoke. We were involved in a restoration of an interior. I believe it was one of the bedroom spaces within that house museum. Let's see. Another one that we would have done fairly recently would be the auditorium space within Northbridge Town Hall. In that case, we did stabilization of deteriorated plaster due to a roof leak that had been repaired. And they did historic paint color analysis. And in addition to stabilizing the plaster work, they did a full restoration based on the original paint color scheme. So those are 3 examples of interiors.
Great, thank you. Another question for MPPF. Can an entity apply for other grants, which if obtained can be used for the 50% matching funds?
We will allow any type of federal grant as the match, but we will not allow any other type of state provided funding. An example of that would be the Mass Cultural Council. They have a cultural facilities fund. If you receive funding through the Mass Cultural Council, that could not serve as a match to the MPPF the state monies. It would be matching state with state. The only other type of quasi state funding would be the Community Preservation Act fund. So communities that have CPA, a Community Preservation Committee, and they've assigned money to a particular historic preservation project. If you come in for MPPF money, you will be able to use the CPA money as either the full match or a portion of your match to the MPPF. But that money will need to be firmly in place, not just, we would need it to have gone beyond just the recommendation stage by the Community Preservation Committee. It would actually need to be confirmed typically through the town meeting process or through the, in the case of a city, through the town council process.
Great, thank you. Another question about emergency acquisition. Can you say more about what is considered imminent and this timing of, and is timing of the application approval process and can you say more about what is considered imminent and this timing of application / approval process interfaces with time trajectory of a threat? So,
okay. Well, again, this is it's a challenging threshold to meet for those who apply for it. We would typically, it would be the threat of demolition. That would be probably the most compelling requests we've had for emergency acquisition. There was the active threat of demolition. Occasionally we'll see a compelling request involving the threat of a developer making inappropriate, perhaps a conversion that might not involve a sensitive reuse, where there would be radical changes made that would interfere with important character defining features of the structure. As part of that process, you would need to demonstrate what that threat is, how long that threat has been in place. Typically, we would need to have an appraisal of the property so that there was a clear understanding of what the value of that property was. I'm trying to think of any other. There is a small portion in the instructions that I referred to, the instructions that are connected with the MPPF application that specifically address the list of other items. And there's 1 or 2 other items, but primarily the challenge is to really demonstrate in detail exactly what that threat is and how long that threat has been going on, and really the bottom line is you're trying to paint a picture that establishes you as a potential applicant as the developer of last resort, and that was certainly the case with the example that I showed earlier of the John Howland House in New Bedford. Whale had stepped in. There was really no other interested parties, and they very much painted a compelling picture of the desperation involved and the development threat for that parcel had they not stepped in.
Thank you, Paul. And that was a really great example. If anyone was on when we did our local advocacy success stories conversation, Terry Bernert from Whale actually shared a picture of the finished result of the Howland House, and it truly is remarkable. Another question: the state shutdown has precluded the visit of resources located in buildings and not available online to completely cover the requirements of historic building surveys and deadlines. Is there any latitude being given to these deadlines due to the impact of COVID-19?
Now, is that specific to MPPF or to survey and planning?
I'm not sure. It was just done as a general question. So I guess, are any deadlines being given any latitude or adjustment because of the coronavirus impact?
Chris, do you want to start?
Sure. I think it's probably a good time for me to just mention our other staff that are involved with survey and planning grants at Mass Historical Commission. So for anything related to historic property survey, that would be Michael Steinitz and then Peter Stott. Both of them are great. If you have questions, probably start with Peter. He works on the survey and planning grants all the time, and very, very helpful. And Michael Steinitz is really the one person that's in charge of all the survey and planning grants in the office. So he's overseeing all of them and dealing with all the contracts for everything, but also quite a bit, and also as survey director involved with the historic property surveys. So either Michael or Peter Stott, if you have questions about anything related to a survey and planning grant project that involves survey, speak with them. Betsy Friedberg is in charge of anything that's related to the National Register nominations, and her assistant is Ben Haley. So talking to either Betsy or Ben regarding eligibility for the National Register, where things are at with the nomination, definitely both of them are very helpful as well. So I think on this question, I would probably start with Peter Stott with your question there in terms of how best to move forward just with all the craziness going on right now.
With the MPPF program, we do have round 25 projects that are in varying stages, and they certainly have all been impacted. All of our development projects have been delayed to a certain extent, and we are reaching out to the Governor's Office of Administration and Finance to come up with the best strategy for allowing these projects to carry beyond June 30th, which is the end of the contract period. So we have already communicated to our ongoing round 25 projects that we will figure out a way, because they are all being in strict compliance with the governor's recommendations, and certainly have been forced to delay progress on projects. So we are absolutely going to figure out a way to allow those projects. For the upcoming cycle, the MPPF cycle typically has applications submitted in March. That would be March of 2021 for the upcoming round 27. At that point, we're not anticipating any impact from the coronavirus, but as we get closer, we'll certainly relay that. We typically receive authorization to release the grant cycle in November or December of the prior year, so that would be November or December of 2020 is when we typically would be getting the approval, the authorization to pull together materials for the upcoming cycle. So if there was to be any impact to the upcoming schedule for round 27, we wouldn't necessarily know about it until the very end of this year, when we typically would get that information. But again, at this point, we're anticipating The cycle in March of 2021, that's when the applications would be due. Grant awards would be made the second week in June, and construction would continue on through to the following June. So that would be most projects would be starting in July or in August or September of 2021 for the upcoming 27 cycle, and would be required to be completed by June 30th of 2022.
Great, thank you, Paul. And I think one last question. I know we're at 11, but I think we can get through this question because this is such an important topic. What proportion of MPPF projects are on the National Register, and is listing on the National Register a barrier to projects applying for funds?
First of all, the State Register of Historic Places includes all properties included in the National Register. Our base requirement for the MPPF program is that your property be currently included within the State Register of Historic Places. So if you have a property that is individually listed within the National Register or considered a contributing building within a National Register district, you are automatically considered to be included in the State Register and therefore eligible for the MPPF program. If you have a property that is currently been inventoried, and there may actually have been an initial determination of eligibility for the National Register process, which Chris described within the Survey and Planning Grant Program. Unless that process has actually occurred, it's not enough to simply have that inventory process and that initial determination of eligibility. That will not be sufficient to meet the requirements for the MPPF. You actually need to have completed that National Register process in order to become officially part of the State Register and therefore eligible. We do find that we do get inquiries, and we point them in the direction of Betsy Friedberg to go through that listing process so that they would be eligible for the MPPF process.
Well, Paul and Chris, I cannot thank you enough for doing this conversation today and sharing all of this wonderful information about these two very important grant programs. I mean, these programs are really amazing tools and resources for us here in Massachusetts. So thank you so much for walking us through MPPF and survey and planning grants and being with us today. I know we went over a little bit, but I felt it was important that we get through all the questions. And if you have questions, or you're watching this on YouTube and you have a question that wasn't answered, my email is up here. Chris's email is up here. Paul had given out his, Paul's email is the same structure as Chris's. But thank you so much for being with us today. And if you have any thoughts about future conversations or other workshop suggestions, email them to Chris, email them to me. We've been finding that this is a great way to connect everybody, but we know, having in person, connecting face to face is great, and we're looking forward to when we can actually do that again. And we're going to keep the conversations going through June on a weekly basis. Next week, I think we're going to circle back with another just general preservation Q&A session with Preservation Mass and MHC. And then we may have, it's a tentative discussion about historic tax credits as another funding source or financial resource for preservation projects. And then we'll come up, we're still working on our topic for June 24th, but this has been a wonderful way to connect. And if you have any suggestions on future conversations, please email us. So thank you so very much for hanging in with us and participating in these conversations. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for all you do for preservation in your community. Have a wonderful day.